I always thought I had time. That was the lie I told myself so often it stopped sounding like a lie. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Just later. Later became my most trusted promise. I used it whenever life felt uncomfortable, whenever a decision asked too much of me, whenever desire threatened to disrupt the order I had built. Later was safe. Later didn't demand courage. Later never argued back. I didn't feel lazy. I felt patient. I told myself I was being responsible. Strategic. Mature. Other people rushed into choices and paid the price. I would wait until the moment felt right. The problem was, that moment never arrived. I remember being younger and feeling everything intensely. Ideas excited me. Possibilities pulled at me like gravity. There were paths I wanted to explore not because they were impressive, but because they felt honest. They scared me. That should have meant something. Instead, I postponed them. I said I needed stability first. Experience. Security. I convinced myself that desire without preparation was dangerous. So I prepared. And prepared. And prepared. Years passed inside that preparation. From the outside, my life looked careful and reasonable. I made choices that were easy to explain. I avoided risks that were hard to justify. People admired my restraint. They said I was disciplined. They didn't know that discipline had quietly turned into avoidance. There's a subtle difference between patience and delay. Patience listens. Delay hides. I hid behind logic. Behind plans that never reached their final step. Behind the belief that someday I would feel ready. Every time an opportunity appeared, a chance to change direction, to speak honestly, to commit, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. What if this isn't the right time? What if I regret it? What if waiting a little longer makes it easier? So I waited. And life, indifferent to my hesitation, kept moving. I watched other people choose imperfectly and live with the consequences. Some failed. Some succeeded. All of them moved. I stayed where I was, refining a future that never arrived. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet realization one evening when I tried to remember the last time I had felt genuinely excited about the future. Not relieved. Not calm. Excited. The memory didn't come. That absence disturbed me more than fear ever had. I noticed how often my conversations were about maintenance rather than growth. About managing what already existed instead of creating something new. I wasn't building a life. I was preserving one. And preservation, I learned, can slowly suffocate intention. Whenever doubt surfaced, I silenced it with the same phrase, "It's not the right moment." That phrase felt responsible. It felt adult. But deep down, I knew the truth I refused to admit: I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I was waiting for the moment to stop being afraid. Time, unfortunately, doesn't negotiate with fear. It keeps moving, whether you participate or not. I remember a specific morning, ordinary, unremarkable, when I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a strange distance. The face staring back wasn't unhappy. It was unfinished. I realized then that I had spent years living in the draft version of my life. Everything provisional. Nothing final. That was when regret began to take shape, not as pain, but as pressure. A growing awareness that postponement has consequences, even if they arrive quietly. I hadn't failed. I hadn't fallen. I had simply not arrived anywhere. And for the first time, I wondered whether later was ever meant to come at all. That question stayed with me, heavy and unresolved, as the days continued to pass, not waiting for my permission. After that realization, time stopped feeling abstract. Before, it had been something theoretical, a concept I could stretch, manage, negotiate with. Now it felt physical. Heavy. Present in every pause. I started noticing how often my days were filled with preparation rather than action. Lists without execution. Plans without commitment. Intentions that never crossed the line into reality. Nothing was technically wrong. That made it worse. If something had collapsed, I could have blamed chaos. If I had failed loudly, I could have blamed error. But I hadn't failed. I had delayed. And delay doesn't leave visible damage. It leaves absence. I tried to return to my old comfort. I told myself I was overthinking. That life doesn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. But that reasoning no longer worked. Because the question wasn't about drama. It was about participation. I realized how rarely I felt fully present in my own decisions. Even the things I chose felt like default settings rather than expressions of will. I began to understand that later had become a way to avoid finality. As long as something was postponed, it remained possible. Untested. Untouched by reality. Possibility felt safer than truth. But possibility also demanded nothing. There was a moment, quiet and deeply uncomfortable, when I did the math in my head. Not years, but attempts. How many times had I told myself I would start when conditions were better? How many times had I promised I'd revisit a choice once I felt more confident? I realized I had been waiting for a version of myself that might never exist. Confidence doesn't arrive before action. It grows from it. And I had starved it. The mental breakdown didn't come as panic. It came as grief. Grief for the things that were no longer available to me. Not because I chose against them, but because I chose nothing long enough for them to expire. Opportunities age. Energy changes. Life moves forward even when you don't. I began to feel the cost of postponement in subtle ways. In conversations where I had nothing new to say about my future. In questions that made me uncomfortable because I had no honest answer. What's next for you? That question used to feel open-ended, now it felt accusatory. I realized I had confused caution with wisdom for so long that I no longer recognized courage when it appeared. When something stirred excitement in me, my first instinct was still to delay. But now, that instinct felt like betrayal. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying moments I had labeled not yet. Not with nostalgia, with accountability. I stopped asking whether I had made the wrong decisions. I started asking whether I had made any. That distinction changed everything. The moral dilemmas sharpened into something unbearable. If I continued postponing, I would preserve safety but sacrifice aliveness. If I acted now, I risked discovering that time had already changed the terms. What if it was too late? That fear kept me frozen longer than I want to admit. Because as long as I didn't try, failure remained hypothetical. Once I acted, reality would respond, and I didn't know how it would. But another thought followed, quieter and more honest: if I don't act, I already know how this ends. The future I was avoiding wasn't uncertain. It was predictable. More delay. More preparation. More waiting for a moment that wouldn't announce itself. I stood in the middle of my life and understood something painful but clarifying: later wasn't patience anymore. It was avoidance disguised as hope. And hope, when disconnected from action, becomes cruel. That was when I felt the shift: not motivation, not confidence, but urgency. Not the panicked kind. The sober kind. The kind that whispers, you don't have endless drafts. And once that thought settled, I knew something had to change, even if I didn't yet know what. The day I finally stopped saying later, nothing spectacular happened. No breakthrough. No applause. No sudden sense of certainty. What happened instead was smaller and heavier. I tried to act on something I had postponed for years. Not perfectly. Not bravely. Simply honestly. And that's when reality answered me. Not harshly. Not kindly. Just truthfully. Some doors were still open, but narrower than I remembered. Some paths required more effort now. Some things, quietly and without drama, were no longer available at all. That was the price of waiting. I didn't collapse when I realized this. I felt something worse. Responsibility. For the first time, I couldn't blame fear, timing, or circumstance. Time hadn't betrayed me. I had negotiated with it and lost. There was grief in that realization. Not explosive grief, but the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. Grief for energy I no longer had. For chances that required a younger version of me. For risks that had transformed into compromises. But beneath that grief was something unexpected. Clarity. I finally understood that later was never a plan. It was a refusal to accept the cost of now. Every choice has a price. Immediate action demands courage. Delay demands time. I had paid with years. I didn't suddenly become bold. I didn't reinvent myself, but I stopped pretending I had infinite drafts. I began choosing anyway, knowing the outcomes would be imperfect, limited, sometimes disappointing. And that honesty changed my relationship with regret. Regret stopped asking why I hadn't done more. It started asking what I was willing to do with what remained. That question was quieter. Fairer. I stopped measuring my life by what it could have been. I started measuring it by what I was still willing to attempt. Some attempts failed. Some succeeded modestly. None of them erased me. I learned that meaning doesn't come from perfect timing. It comes from participation. From stepping into the present without guarantees. If you're listening to this and still telling yourself later, I won't scare you with urgency. Life is patient. But it is not endless. Later doesn't arrive as a moment. It arrives as a realization, usually when options have already changed. I didn't lose my life by failing. I nearly lost it by postponing. And now, even with fewer choices, fewer illusions, fewer years ahead than behind, I finally understand something I wish I had learned sooner: you don't need the right moment to begin. You need the courage to accept that this moment is all you ever get. I don't live urgently now. I live deliberately. And that finally feels like arrival.